So now we have arrived. Heavy lifting is mostly done. We're finally getting to the point where Johannes Climacus doubts on his own. We are in the second part and the third introduction. Second part, Johannes tries to think proporius auspicius de omnibus datium est, on his own about everything that must be doubted. And of course, it should come as no surprise that we have a little asterisk there and a little note at the very beginning that we can't just simply turn a title page and move into the next chapter. It states that out of his solitude for the young Johannes Climacus, unless he seemed to be preoccupied with sheer folly, although he obviously is no genius at schismatizing paragraphs, nor has he been drilled into the compendiums of the last 10 years. I take the opportunity to recall how the issues he touches on have previously been advanced in philosophy. So we're going to be drawing through here in this introduction the relations of what Johannes is doing. That there's a little bit more work that's going to be done in this introduction than simply jumping in to the notions of doubt. So we have finally found ourselves in the introduction here. And it, of course, reiterates once again that this is a narrative form as it begins with this poetic venture. Just as the fish that has grabbed its prey on the surface of the water goes to the bottom of the sea, so Johannes now was alone with the thesis in the depths of his soul, right? This imagery of the fish jumping out of the water to exposing itself to everybody, grabbing on to its prey and then bringing it inside of itself and diving back down deep, protecting itself, wrapping itself around this idea that's the most precious. This is the imagery we should see of Johannes over the idea that he too is now going to begin to philosophize. For a time he surrendered to the various moods evoked by the mere possession of something, the true meaning of which one still cannot fathom. He allowed himself to be moved variously by the many thoughts about the difficulty of the task, about the complicated inventionments, about the fruitless attempts, about the moments of triumph, about the romantic way in which he would come to exist, that he's coming to be in this very act. In short, he enjoyed the sweet joys and sorrows of a first love affair. That this is true love that's being brought out. Now love, ardently in love, as we had learned about Johannes at the very beginning. In what? In thought. That everything is in the mind, to go back to notions of earlier discussions with Berkeley and others. It is just as Hippel says somewhere, Es geht mit der Wissenschaften wie mit der Liebe. That science and scholarship are like love. That what is stolen is the most pleasant. Right? The idea of forbidden fruit adds a little value to something, that it makes it that much more precious. As he gradually came more and more to himself and increasingly felt the need and the energy to set about defending the task in a more specific form, he also tried to decide whether or not something in what he remembered of the philosophizers' discussions could give an instructive clue. One does not start out on a journey around the world in the same way that one starts out for a stroll. Right? That there's a different way you're going to approach your monumental work. You're now showing that you have mastered a subject than it would be for any small task of just kind of thinking and speculating about something. That you're needing to approach this very differently. You're going to make sure you're prepared, even though you don't know of all of the things that are going to come about. In some ways, you're going to have things that you don't need along those journeys. In a lot of ways, you're going to not have everything that you do need, but you're going to start and you're going to think about what it is you need for this journey as you begin it. Not knowing the irksome troubles of a journey, the soul hides in pensive, elevating devotions as courage and enthusiasm contend in romantic boldness with a certain anxiety. But even though one relies entirely on oneself in this manner, still nothing is more natural than to heed the reports of those who have attempted the same thing. You want to hear what others have done along these journeys. You want to know what their pitfalls were and what their successes were. Johannes was well aware at this point that he dared not expect to find a complete information in what the philosophizer said as a sailor has in his chart. But he also knew that the mind is not subject to multifariousness and that its movement is much more uniform. We can actually take a quick little pause here and kind of see how Johannes is engaging in this whole notion of beginning to doubt, beginning the task at hand. And we can kind of see two side debates that exist in philosophy. To go to one, we can see the Clifford and James debate, right, where Clifford said that it was wrong always and everywhere for anyone to believe anything on insufficient evidence. And therefore, Johannes would never have proceeded. He never had sufficient evidence on what he needs to do. We just covered that with these earlier theses while he's navigating and discussing everything, that everything had to begin with him. And even though he might be somewhat prepared for this task, that he couldn't therefore believe in anything, according to Clifford and his strong standards. Instead, he'd side a lot more with James, that he has to have the will to believe, that it's only in the believing that he's able to move forward and proceed. In other ways, this is echoing the debate between the skeptics and the Stoics. Right? For both of them, the idea is that wisdom is incompatible with error, following from arguments of Socrates and others that most of our passional nature comes out of our notions of ignorance, that we have an incomplete knowledge of what we're expecting. But the skeptics added on to this that if wisdom is indeed incompatible with error, then the best thing to do is to abandon all judgments. And yet, what is it Johannes is engaged in right here? It's in making judgments. It's in proceeding. It's about boldly going forth, even though he doesn't have all of that information, even though he's going to know that he's only somewhat prepared for that, but there will be some error. So we can kind of tease out these other debates here and just the stage that has been set. And it's one of these nice advantages of having this narrative form, that we're seeing this journey and this thought, and we don't need to have an aside within the actual work that says, by the way, Clifford, come on, no one works that way. That's impossible. Come on, skeptics, quit being so skeptical. There's going to be a little bit of error wrapped within everything. You still have to proceed in life, right? That we can have these ideas just teased out because the stage is set to make these debates, and what we've now felt ourselves compelled to do to move the story forward, to live life, to become a philosopher. The end of 163, beginning of 164, we are told that Johannes prodded his memory and began to feel very ill at ease. For it became clear to him that in the philosophizer's discussions, there was scarcely a word about all the fates and adventures in which one might be tried when going forth to doubt everything. No one knows and anticipates much of anything, and we can even tie in the notion of apprehension and what's going to happen, and delight, and all of these other threads that we've already addressed, right? And yet one would have expected to hear this. One would think that this would be their favorite topic, just as seafarers love to talk about their close calls, especially if they met men who had navigated the same ocean. If some of them have wanted to lie about such an experience without actually having had it, he would have understood. But he also hoped to be able to distinguish the experienced man from the parrot by the fervency of what was said. But it was inexplicable that everyone remained silent. Could it be that what they had seen was so terrible that they dreaded to speak of it? Yet they were indeed associated with men who must have seen the same thing. If indeed we have a relation of apprehension, like Bonaventure spoke about it, and that changing how we're going to receive some stimula coming in, why is it that people who have gone through this are not providing any of that groundwork for those who are going to come afterwards, not telling them what they might want to anticipate and the desire and love of philosophy by actually going through this path? Continuing, though, he says, admittingly, it was not altogether the case that Johannes had not heard one word from the philosophizers about this matter, but when he refreshed his memory regarding the little that he had heard, he nevertheless had to confess that it amounted to nothing, and that it was quite in order. At one time that particular statement only discouraged him. When, for example, he once heard a lecture on the importance of having doubted as a preliminary to philosophy, the following statement was made in his presence: one must not waste time on doubting, but should just start at once in philosophy. Of course, this is a very clear statement towards Hegel and pushing towards Hegel. And of course, then what is the response to this? He says that the listeners seize the information with the same joy with which Catholics seize the announcement of an indulgence. But that somehow the work and the labor that you've undergone to become a philosopher, all of this doubt that you should do, forget about it. Just get your reward and move forward. Like, this is the sort of parallel of what Johannes is making. This is the sort of dig that Kierkegaard is making against this modern sort of vein of philosophy that's really no different than the notion of an indulgence. But here, instead of coming from the Pope, it's coming from Hegel. Right? It's now a philosophical indulgence that says that you don't have to do the work, you don't have to maintain the ideas, and yet at the same time, this is not a dig at Catholicism and the notion of the indulgence there, but it's the dig on modern philosophy in general, people who call themselves philosophers. That again, the job is to make things difficult. We see this theme throughout all of Kierkegaard's writings, that real life, for him, the epitome of Christianity, is something that requires struggle and work. And so this idea that you could just jump into philosophy, that you don't need to waste your time on doubting, just jump in. That is a betrayal of what it means to be a true philosopher, according to Kierkegaard. So what is the response from our young Johannes? It states that Johannes was, however, so ashamed on behalf of the speaker that he wished himself far away, so that way no one could see it on his face. Even an ordinary person, he said to himself, tries to do what he says, yet ignorance it can happen that he does something else because he does not understand himself. But this cannot happen with the philosopher. But to say right out that it is not worth the trouble to do what one at other times assures us has to be done, deliberately, to leave undone what one as a rule emphatically declares to be necessary condition, this is to hold both oneself and philosophy in contempt. Right? That this idea of just diving in weakens the strength of philosophy. Right? And so here we have a very pointed criticism of the Hegelian system, of this idea that philosophy is this unfolding Geist, that you don't need to start with notions of doubt, but just jump in, that you're holding your own abilities in contempt, that nobody else can doubt for you. You must do this on your own. You can't just follow Descartes and say, well, he did it. You need to go through and sense this and endure the pain and the struggle of doubting yourself. Another time, it said that he heard one of the philosophizers, one whose utterances people especially trusted, express himself this way: to doubt everything is no easy matter, something we would agree with. It is, namely, not doubt about one thing and another, about this or that, about something and something else, but it is a speculative doubt about everything, which is by no means an easy matter. He recollected how alert he was at the beginning of this lecture, how dejected at the end, since he perceived that not a single word had actually been said. I just talked about how this is difficult, and maybe it's some sort of notion of speculative doubt about everything, that it's an attitude, and yet where do you go? How do you engage? How do you know what doubt is? It would have been better if the speaker, he says, had not said more than the first words. For what followed said nothing, although it gave the appearance of saying something, and therefore it was curious that the lecture was not much longer. If indeed he's spending all of his time just saying something that sounds like he's saying something, why didn't he carry on even farther? For when someone talks in this manner, he must have enormously much to say. Johannes then bade the philosophizers farewell forever. Right? We're going to see that those who talked and these theses and the discussion that's been there, it's all going to be something he puts away, and he's going to begin the journey on his own. Even if he now and then heard a particular observation by them, he decided to pay no more attention to them, inasmuch as he had so many sad experiences of how deceitful their words were. He now followed the method he was in the habit of following, namely, to make everything as simple as possible. But this now becomes his new method, the idea of trying to simplify and reduce. And of course, we can think of Occam and the law of parsimony here in this connection, right? That given all things being equal, the simpler of the two options is usually the correct one. That usually, if we can boil something down and understand it, the simplicity can lead us to understanding what things are instead of overly complicating it, saying very little in the process.